Hello, welcome to Beyond Grades, using authentic assessment to empower artistic voice. I'm Jeanne Bjork, and this is Janet Taylor. Janet?
Hi, I'm Janet Taylor, and I have been an art teacher for high school for about 11 years. Prior to that, I was a scenic artist in film and theater. But I teach out in the western suburbs of Chicago. I originally taught in Chicago public schools, and I teach a little bit of everything, which I want to say is probably one of the biggest reasons why I ended up moving to Choice, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So I'm a Choice art teacher, and I'm also a writer for Art of Ed.
And like I said, I'm Jeanne Bjork. I've been teaching for a long time. We won't say how long. But I started out actually, even though I was an art ed major, I started out in the regular ed classroom as a first grade teacher in California. And then I worked for a bit as a web designer. I've been at Pewaukee High School for 20 years, which is a western suburb of Milwaukee. I teach most of the advanced classes, like all of the 2D content, and I also teach a lot of digital art classes. I would consider my program a modified choice art program, and we're going to learn what that means in just a few minutes. I write articles once or twice a year for School Arts Magazine, and some of you may recognize me as the former board member, the web designer and social media person for WAEA. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different things that have to do with choice and assessment and grades versus no grades. And so this is just our overview of what you'll be learning.
But as Jeanne and I were making this presentation, we realized you probably need a little bit of information about what choice is in the first place before you can understand where we're coming from with our grading policies. So choice art, we're not going to go into depth over it, but basically it's not a free-for-all. It is not students just do whatever they want. It's not like that at all. In fact, it's a lot of scaffolding with a lot of supports. It includes both technical and conceptual thinking. So it's not just like a feel-good place. It's a feel-good plus, you know, your technical skills that you're developing. It supports them through their creative processes, and everybody's classroom in choice art, just like any other art classroom, looks very different, or could look very different. Ultimately, the goal of choice is to empower student voice. So one of the things that I wanted to explain real quick is choice. You can kind of see on the left-hand side there, ways that we teach and learn, from projects to choice-based to tab and STEAM and design thinking, and then all the way to the artwork. Your goal is always to get the students to creating original artwork, but how you get there is kind of up to you and your students' needs. So that's why we love that choice continuum. It's that sliding scale that moves back and forth to allow us to address our students where they're at. And we're going to talk a lot about that during our grades and assessment piece. So just keep that in the back of your mind, that that choice continuum is kind of that driving force. Of course, our curriculum is always steeped in the creative process with our art standards, and also the studio habits of mind that kind of help guide us on our daily journey through our creative process.
So we got you to come to this by telling you there were no grades. What a radical idea. That idea of, you know, getting rid of all grades. I know that grading is difficult. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what is that difference between grades and assessment. And when I became a choice teacher, I really started to disconnect a little bit from how I was assessing and grading work, because there was a lot of cool stuff going on in my classroom, but I felt like it didn't quite mesh with all of what I had been doing in the past. So we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of what does no grading look like. So in my classroom, I kind of came upon this idea when I was sitting in an SLO PPG meeting with my administrator, where you have to like prove that you're a good teacher. And I was like, why do I have to do that? You know, and you have to show artifacts that document who you are as a teacher and what your successes were. And, you know, I kind of changed my attitude about that. I looked at it and I was like, you know, this is actually a really great opportunity for me to showcase and highlight what my students have learned, and get my administrator to see it, because a lot of times administrators aren't really, you know, they don't come to the art room all the time. So, so anyway, I started to look at it as a chance to really start to build this real conversation. And then I was like, why aren't we asking students to do that? Why don't we ever ask students, well, what did you learn? And so I started to think about that process of documenting your learning, and that it's not just grade a project and then you're done. It's this continuum of documentation. And I also started to think about, do we always have to have the same kind of critique? And does that critique always have to end in a rubric and a grade? And so I started to think about how could we vary critiques and how could that become more choice-based too? And so I also kind of thought about the idea of, when I went in for my master's degree, I had to defend my thesis through an exhibit and through a talk and a paper. And I thought, really, students should be able to verbalize that synthesis of learning. They should be able to say, through all of these things, these examples of my learning, I learned X, Y, and Z. So that's kind of where I started to go with this. I piloted a class, and I didn't give grades. I didn't give any grades for any projects. The only grades students got were the grade that we determined together at the end of a quarter. And you'll see a little bit later what that looks like.
So I was in a similar boat, right? So I had moved to Choice and I was speaking all the time about how I've changed my classroom into this amazing experience for my students. And I was saying that they're really authentically engaged in the learning process through Choice. So I was pretty excited about this. But I was presenting on this and I thought, you know what, I better put my money where my mouth is and ensure that my students were really authentically engaged in the learning. And it wasn't about the grades or the points that they were receiving, because up until that point for several years, I was giving them points for every single thing or giving them grades, giving them that percentage letter. So I felt like if I'm valuing certain aspects of my teaching practice and what my students should be doing, then I should also ensure that that's how I'm teaching their understanding of what's important in my classroom. So I did the same thing. I piloted a class last year, and I started with my administration. I had to pitch it to them because we have a grade book system in place that we have to kind of align, as I'm sure everybody does. And I also wanted to make sure that if there were any issues along the way, that my administration was also on board and could help answer questions with parents. So I wrote a letter out to my parents and then explicitly told my students that this is what we're doing, that this is a piloted class and we're going to try it out. And I think being upfront with your students about how you're grading is really going to be very important, or how you're assessing. And so students can get right on board and you're basically reteaching them how to think. Working within that system, I still had assignment grades, but they were focused on standards and feedback, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. With a feedback flow where my students started as apprentices, moved into artists within my classroom, and it was focusing on that dialogue. We did have grades because we had to, but they were like on-track grades, progress kind of along the way that helped students understand, kind of wrap their head around what's happening in the classroom and how that translates when they get out of the classroom, because they still have to have a grade on their transcript. And ultimately, it's really about teaching your community what authentic learning looks like. And as Jeanne said, that evidence of learning is really, really important to show what's actually happening in your class, right? So we want to make sure that people are not just seeing product and outcome, but they're also seeing the actual learning happening and what that might look like. And you could do that in a lot of different ways between social media or having some sort of interactive gallery in order to do that. So you might be wondering like, okay, great, no grades. That sounds cool. I'm on board. Or maybe you're like, you're crazy. But there is a distinct difference between grading and assessment. And this is where Jeanne and I think, both came to this conclusion through our choice practice, was that we were giving our students points for everything that they were learning, and they were in this like learning phase, and it just felt wrong. Like, they're learning this, why should they be receiving a percentage or a letter grade on this? And so trying to decipher the difference between grades and assessment is a big piece, I think, to understanding where you can go with this. So the first one is the goal of grading. So the goal of grading is really to assign a standardized percentage or letter in order to reward achievement, right? You a kid does something, and then they receive that percentage or letter grade, and it's not focused on the learning. The goal of assessment, however, is to provide constant and consistent feedback in order to engage students in authentic learning and to grow as individuals. So you're really working with them one-on-one in that feedback sense. So when you kind of break that down, I tried to come up with as many pros and cons on both sides, because there are pros and cons to both grading and assessment, or how you kind of view that. So the goals of grading, the pros are that everyone already knows how it works. It's an established system that we've all grown up with. We all know what it means and how percentage and letter grades work. It is group oriented, and it's really fast for the teacher to do that, right? But there's cons, and this is where I think, you know, this journey has changed, right? Is that I started thinking that assigning numbers and letters does not actually teach someone what it is that they're learning or identify what they're learning. It's punitive. It feels like if I fail, that's a bad thing, and I do not value that in my class, right? Failure is something I value in order to learn. It's also reinforcing that you get a reward. It's almost like getting that sticker chart. Instead of going, oh, I did something good, I'm getting that sticker or that A on my assignment, and then I'm done. It's oftentimes arbitrary. For me, it felt really bad to assign a 93% versus a 96%, for example, because, you know, those are such a minute change. What's the difference? This is very end product driven, right? So you're looking at getting positive skills along the way, getting a reward for that in order to get an end product that is an A. You're also encouraging students to compare against each other. Like, this is what I can do, and this is what I can't do. And so therefore it destroys that confidence. When we look at the goals of assessment, though, there tends to be a lot more pros than cons, right? In my opinion, in my viewpoint of that. So when we're looking at our goals of assessment, the pros are that it's actually encouraging dialogue through that feedback between student to student or student and teacher. It's focusing on the process and driven by growth, which we will talk more about. It encourages that risk-taking and builds confidence because students are no longer comparing. They're actually kind of inspired by each other, and it looks at the students as a whole instead of you know, moment to moment, whether I'm completing something on track or not. And then it empowers thinking in general. So students are really, you're engaging in that dialogue, and you're pushing back, and it's thinking instead of A and done. And ultimately, you're meeting your students where they're at. So whether they're high achieving or struggling with some other concepts, you get to decide how you're addressing with them with your dialogue. And so therefore, you're pushing students no matter what level that they're at. The downside, of course, is that it does take more time. You do have to teach your system to your students, and you do have to rewire their expectations, especially those A kids who expect, like, oh, I just have to do this, I complete this, and I'm done. You have to really reteach them in thinking about your system and learning for authentic learning's sake.
So part of this assessment model is that you kind of have two ways of assessing. One would be that the teacher leads the assessment process, and the other is that the student leads the assessment process. And I kind of think of the teacher-led model as the more traditional model. The teacher is determining what gets assessed, the teacher is probably making the rubric, and the teacher is ultimately giving the grade. Along that way, there could be, you might actually have students participate in the process. They might self-grade, but a lot of times the teacher is the one who, bottom line, determines that grade. And in that system, students a lot of times might feel powerless. They might feel a little bit disengaged. They might not quite understand, you know, why did I get what I got? And it's just kind of weird to be giving a grade to a piece of art. We don't go to a gallery and go, ooh, that's an A painting or that's a B painting. It's just very not how we talk about art. And so that teacher-led model, as Janet was mentioning, like, is it a 93 or a 96? It feels very arbitrary. Whereas the student-led model is really this collaboration between the student and the teacher. And together they determine what is going to be assessed. They create authentic artifacts and documentation of that learning, and the teacher or the student might create the rubric, and the student, along with the teacher in collaboration, determines the grade. So it feels more meaningful. The student is able to differentiate and individualize what they learn and what they get out. Every student in my class sets goals at the beginning of a course and at the beginning of a unit. And so for them, they can really individualize what they have achieved. So as I said, I started to really get kind of disillusioned with my grading practices and my assessment practice. I really started to be like, this just isn't working in a choice classroom. I had a lot of really cool stuff that was happening. I had a lot of really awesome things that students were doing. There were these great conversations going on, peer-to-peer, student-to-teacher. And then, you know, I'd be like, okay, and now let's stick a grade on that. And, you know, it was kind of anticlimactic, you know, womp womp. So anyway, so I started to think about how could I involve students more, and how could I make this experience more relevant to what they need to learn. So I started to work on developing a collaborative model where teacher and student were working together. I started to ask students to tell me, what did you discover through this unit? What did you discover when we had a boot camp on alternative media? You know, so I started asking and really listening. This really takes trust on your part, and it takes kind of re-educating yourself to look at what students are learning and to trust them to tell you what they learn. And sure, there's going to be some kids are going to be like, oh yeah, you know, I'm great, I did everything. And you're like, what? But honestly, the more you teach them this process, they're pretty honest and they're pretty good about it. So I was fortunate a couple years ago to be part of an in-service where we studied the work of John Hattie and his idea of visible learning. And I really wanted to instill this in my classroom. So the graphic you see here, it's kind of the definition of what learning is. So that idea of giving students some surface knowledge that helps them move to deeper understanding and eventually allows them to transfer that learning to new tasks and new situations. So it's that idea of synthesis. And so could assessment itself be a learning experience? That was something that I kind of hypothesized, and I found that it could. Students learn public speaking skills, they learn how to write, they learn how to speak up for themselves and advocate, to defend their thesis and say, this is what I think I learned, and this is how it's going to apply in life. So I think that documentation of learning does in fact help make the assessment process itself a learning function and really valuable to students beyond the art room. So one of the ways that I felt I had to change my practice was critiques. So critiques were very formulaic. They were always kind of the same, and they just weren't getting my students to where they need to get. And I wasn't seeing the results I wanted. I think critique is a very powerful process, but the way we were doing them, it was always the same. It always resulted in a rubric being filled out and a grade being assigned. And I decided that through choice, and in choice classroom, there are all these wonderful interactions that take place. And critique was one of those places where things could be a little different. So I developed this idea of a speed dating critique. I thought it would be kind of funny. And so students got to play two different roles. They got to be the presenter, where they were actually presenting their work. And then they got to be the critiquer, where they were giving feedback to the student who presented. And then they just kept moving from position to position. Obviously, this was before COVID, because you'll see in a moment in the video that we are quite close together. But it was a fun process, and I think it was really valuable to students. So let's watch the video. They also have shading. Something. No. So I think that So as you can see, there's a lot of excitement. It captures how students like to learn because they love to talk. And it's just a much richer experience. So the speed dating critique was not graded for just that, but it was a way for students to gather feedback and add one more artifact to the documentation of what they learned. So it's part of that bigger picture. Just a quick snippet of what that looked like. So as you can see, there's a lot of energy there. There's a lot of excitement. And then they did turn in, you know, they had like a little paper where they were keeping track, and I read through those comments, and it was helpful to me to see what did the students learn. And it just felt more authentic and more relevant to how students are. They like to talk. They like to talk to each other. So another thing that we're all thinking about right now is, you know, what does assessment look like during quarantines? You know, and I know we're all back in school in various forms. Some are completely virtual. Some of us are in hybrid models. And so I started to, one of the things I hated last spring when I was in quarantine and teaching all online, it was like, it's all me. It's constantly all me. And how do I get the students more involved and get that choice-based classroom happening online? And so there are some ways you could do this. So the idea of using a breakout room in Zoom, you can set up small groups. You can have mini critiques that way. Using Google Folders is another great way to organize your content. So students have their picture in there, they have their artist statement in there, and you can put that up on screen and go through and have pretty decent critiques as a group. Google also has other add-ons that I've shared here that you can organize and do other kinds of things, small groups and things like that. So if you can trust your students in your Zoom meeting, perhaps you can make a student an administrator and allow them to share their screen in these breakout rooms. So it's kind of similar to what you would do in your classroom. You trust a student leader for a group. It's kind of the same idea. And I know a lot of us were really scared of those Zoom bombs last year, but I think we're all over that now. And hopefully students would be trustworthy enough to maybe help run some of what you're doing online. And then lastly, in Canvas, we just learned that you can actually create cohorts within a class. So like I'm teaching in a hybrid model. So I have some kids in the classroom, A through K, Monday, Tuesday. Then I have L through Z, Thursday, Friday. And then I also have some kids who are all virtual. So by being able to differentiate in Canvas in my learning management system, it helps with how can I set this up and how can I assess differently and continue that choice-based assessment.
So as we've been talking about, that feedback piece is really going to be important in your assessment. The goal of feedback is to provide that real-time information for students to reflect, improve upon, and push thinking beyond the rubric expectation. So what's the difference between that and the loop? Well, the loop is to really engage fully in the creative process between both student and teacher. So as Jeanne was saying, you know, it felt like it was all about me. We want to engage that dialogue between, and it pushes that learning and thinking to empower student voice. So as Jeanne was saying earlier too, that there's this piece where you're like, you have to trust your students to talk about assessment or be able to talk about their artwork in an informed way. And part of that is with choice, you're already starting to empower that voice and that confidence building. And so in the feedback loop, it becomes where the teacher is more of a guide and asking more questions. Instead of saying, this is what you should do, we're saying, well, what happens if you do this? Or where do you want to go with this? And so that feedback loop becomes really, really important in assessment. This is a graphic that I found. If you're a little confused of what the feedback loop might look like, this is a good example. I'm not going to go into it, but thought it would be helpful to share.
So we have a lot of different types of assessment going on in our classrooms from day to day. We have the formative assessment, all of those check-ins, the feedback loop, all of that kind of stuff happens. It's pretty informal. We then have the summative kinds of things where it's very formal. It's at an end of a unit or an end of a section. And then you have that cumulative growth model where perhaps that's happening during your exams. So we're going to talk about a little bit more about what that looks like.
So Jeanne and I set this up a little differently, as you would as well in your classroom, because of your needs and expectations of your from your administration in school. But I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what this might look like. So in my classroom, it used to be, right, all of the, you might have a unit, a project. So in ceramics, you might do like everybody's doing a pinch pot. And so all of the daily ins and outs that go in might be points. And then at the end of the unit, you would assign a summative grade, and then that would be done and you'd move on to the next. So that was also a piece of my thinking, was this is a disconnect as well. Everything should grow and build together. And in choice, when you scaffold it appropriately, that's what happens. So I started using different language in my classroom so that students could understand how they're being assessed as well. So when it comes to the formative, the day-to-day, the skill building. And like I said, I don't really like to give that punitive grade when students are trying to learn, right? We want to give them space to learn and to fail and to take risks. And so I talk about my formative as tools in your toolbox. Literally, my choice classrooms are set up as toolboxes. Some people use the word boot camps or workshops or skill builders. I use toolbox, which is kind of silly, but it makes a point that later on, the idea is that students are constantly building skills in their tools in their toolbox to later choose which tools that they need to use to apply to the artwork that they envision, right? So I don't put points to my toolbox formative. I do set up my grade book so that it's marks for formative. It gives an idea of standards of where they're at. So they might be meeting, exceeding, or emerging, that kind of a thing. But again, it's all through feedback. If they're emerging, then I give a little comment about why. So even if it's not obviously in the day-to-day, in the moment, we're talking about it, but also it's visual for the students to access later. They're practicing their skills, they're practicing their concepts and their creative process. They're kind of learning about the creative process. What does it look like to plan? What does it look like to go through the creation phase, right? And then throughout that, I scaffold it so that they have mini projects. So their projects that they used to have, so that pinch pot might be a much smaller piece of the pie now. So maybe they have a much smaller pinch pot that they're making, so that they're showing that they can understand those skills and apply it to make something else. I oftentimes call them challenges to help them rethink about what their grade means or what that means towards applying later. And this usually takes about half to 2/3 of the semester, and depending on the content, so my classes are 1 semester long and they're content specific. Depending on that, each class kind of looks a little differently. I set them all up based on the curriculum. And then later in the semester, students are actually applying those skills that they've learned to make meaning, right? So that all along they've also learned how to make meaning and how to do all those things too. But now they have that choice of true choice of where they want to go with that. This might be 2 to 3 in a semester. It depends again on how much time or how elaborate a student is making it. It really takes that piece off of, this is what I expect, again, in my grades in order to get an A. Now I'm looking at the student and fostering what they're interested in and how they want to learn and how they want to demonstrate those skills. How are they demonstrating that creative process in action as opposed to like practicing it, right, by what I provide to them. And then the reflection piece always goes beyond I'm finished, right? So instead of I'm done with my pinch pot and now I move on, it instead is connecting with their next pieces. So ultimately, we look at that cumulative. So in the, previously I used to have a final exam. This was a district, assessment where they might have an artwork that they have to do, and we're all aligned in that. And I really felt like that was a lot of pressure on my students to ask them to come up with an artwork at the end to demonstrate everything they learned. That is just not even authentic as an artist to create like that. So instead, I wanted to ensure that my students knew that I was valuing their growth that they've made. So no matter where they started, they need to show some sort of growth based on what they've learned. And in order to do so, I start them with a growth portfolio. You can do this with a physical portfolio. You can do it with a digital. We do Google Slides. And they start that on day one. And just like Jeanne was saying, you want to have that evidence of learning, that artifact. It really, what it is making their education really explicit. You're showing them what they have learned along the way. They're talking about their work and what they have learned. And at the end of everything, they're able to kind of look back and say, oh, wow, I've really learned. It wasn't just about a pinch pop, move on. It was, I learned how to do a coil, and then I can apply that to this and look at this artwork that I made about me and my ownership of that.
So mine is similar, but a little different. So it's all about this process of learning, and everything kind of contributes to that growth. And so there are all those mini formative kinds of check-ins that happen. I do boot camps, I do media experimentation. We do some collaborative things together. My students keep a visual journal, and everything they do goes into that visual journal. So the journal gets to be really fat. It's stuffed with things. It's evidence of their learning. And the visual journal is where they do their planning. It's where they do their proposals about, here's what I think I want to do for this unit. They look at artists' work. They might have chats with each other. They might have these little mini check-ins, as I said. And so all of that gets put into the visual journal. And so while each section of that is formative, and in my grade book, it's basically just a check mark. You did it or you didn't do it. We use Skyward, and you have the ability to put grades in as a number, or you can put grades in as a check mark. And so the check mark just means you did it or you didn't, because I'm not really assessing individually the quality of what you did. But then there is a summative planning meeting. So when the student actually has done all of this leading up to it, and we could take a week to 2 weeks before we ever actually start on the project, depending on what what the project is. And so all of that mini stuff leads up to this planning meeting. And that's when they come and meet with me one-on-one. And they tell me, here's what I think I want to do. Here's what I investigated while I was planning this. I looked at these artists, etc. And so all of those formative things become a grouping of one summative. So then a grade does go in the grade book that you had all of this. And so sometimes there's students who don't do what they're supposed to do. Imagine. I'm sure you have a few of those. My students aren't all fabulous. There's some pretty mediocre kids as well. And so, sometimes they don't do what they're supposed to do. So the way I have it worded on my rubrics is, one of the things says there is not enough evidence of this to get credit or whatever, something like that it says. So the idea that, they don't just get away with it because there's no grades. Like a check mark saying you did or didn't might seem like nothing. So there is some credit being given for process and for what they say. And so then the second aspect of every unit is the actual art project that they make, the bigger project. And depending, I also teach in a media-based curriculum. So in drawing one, painting one, etc. So we're looking at the 3 C's of good quality art creation. So we look at conceptual development, craftsmanship with the media, and then the kinds of composition that students are setting up. We also are a standards-based school, so we are using standards of create, plan, present, and respond, which are similar to the national standards. And then it's that idea of grading this whole process, grading for their learning. So looking at it as a whole, And then my final exams really are kind of like what Janet said, it's this growth, showing growth, showing a portfolio or a selection from a portfolio where the student says, here's what I learned. So let's take a look at what this could look like, what that growth portfolio might include. So this is a student who was a really high achieving student. She was a senior last year. And the slides you see, or the picture you see over here on the left, these are her AP Art portfolio. It's part of an assessment towards the end of a unit. And in AP, we had to document our process and show our learning. And so these slides show what she did to develop her artwork for this final unit. She also was in my digital illustration class. And so what you're about to watch is a video of her conferencing with me at the end of a quarter, explaining what she learned and sharing the artifacts of her learning with me. So tell me about some of the artifacts that you chose to share and a little bit about why.
Okay, well, my goals for this whole unit and like all these units were 3 different things, and that was learning how to use Photoshop, because I've never used Photoshop before, and then learning how to have better color palettes, because I've always struggled with color, and then I also wanted to work on my composition, so the composition actually meant something and it wasn't just there. So I have the Unit 1 final because this was my first time using Photoshop to actually like make an art piece. And you can see how I've been experimenting, and I experimented with divide and multiply and with the different brushes. That's why I had my brushes as evidence in there too. But I feel like this also works with color because it's kind of muddy in the statues, and the color kind of just consumes the figure.
Knowledge, and I want students like you who are really good at things to grow too. Sometimes a teacher lets like the top of the class just kind of float.
Yeah.
And I don't want you to float. I want you to, win the race. And you gave yourself a 4. Yes. I would totally agree with that.
Thank goodness.
Yes, you work super hard and you have shown a lot of growth. And I think you could have come in here with kind of an attitude, with a little chip on your shoulder, maybe like I know everything, but you didn't. You've been very open to learning, and you've also been really willing to share with other people, which I think is helpful. I kind of look to you as a leader in this class, so I've learned a lot from you. So as you can hear, having that trust in your students, I'm very comfortable being really honest with them, and they are pretty comfortable being honest with me. And I think that builds trust. And I think in a choice classroom, you have to have trust in your students, and you have to build that collaborative relationship with them. I would also point out how powerful that was for a student to speak for themselves and to advocate for themselves, and to say, here's what I did, and I think it's really great. And so I really feel this process is very powerful. If you can move towards student-led assessment, I think you'll find it's incredible.
So we just wanted to leave you with a quick conclusion. Remember that assessment is not punitive. It's driven by feedback, and it's going to create that authentic learning environment that you and we all want. We really want to empower student voice, and it's part of a collaborative process of learning in the choice-based classroom.
So another thing is just, I'd really love to encourage you to grow your practice. Take a risk. We're all in this crazy time right now anyway. We're all being forced to do a bunch of things that we never dreamed we'd be doing. So why not just go with it and have some fun and play and try some new things? Also, give yourself grace. This didn't happen overnight. I still feel very I'm not worthy. Janet is amazing. I'm just barely learning this myself. And so give yourself grace, figure out where you are in this process, and ask your students to help. Students are awesome. High school students are really fantastic. And there are a lot of good kids in our classes, no matter where you teach. So ask them to help you. Tell them about what you're trying to do. And I think they will surprise you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we've provided a bunch of additional resources for you you know, to help you with kind of some of what we've thought were really great things. So thanks again. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.